We are so excited to be here today to talk about navigating an uncertain world and how you can help safeguard your organization and workplace amid a crisis, whether that's globally or specific to a country or a region. And I am here as our Director of Global Business Solutions, Jennifer Kovalick. I've been with Workplace Options for 12 years, and it's my job to work with multinational organizations to help them make educated decisions around support programs for their employees and their families all around the world. And with me today, I have Breia Foston, who I'm so excited to record our first podcast.
Thank you, Jen. It's a pleasure to be here and be partnering with you. So Breia Foston, I have been in the global insurance industry space for 15 years, and I am the CEO and founder of Worldview Benefit Advisors, and I have spent my entire, 15-year career helping to design and deliver innovative and strategic benefit solutions for a diverse range of clients across different regions and industries in the world, just helping them to optimize, their benefit programs and enhance employee engagement and retention strategies. And I am really looking forward to the conversation we have today to talk about how we create, just a better program for the global workforce that's out there that's helping to support these multinational companies. So happy to be here.
Oh, so glad you're here. We have a lot that we want to cover today. And while we were prepping, we were really trying to think about what we find our clients want to talk about in this space. And Breia has such a unique background. She has a lot of really good insight around this. And if you get nothing from today, the three things we really want you to get around what we're going to talk about and share today are due diligence, communication, and support around navigating that uncertain world. And when we're talking about due diligence, the questions that we're thinking are you dedicating sufficient time to review, assess, really think about the existing support systems that you have in place? And hopefully this helps you effectively navigate appropriate care for your workforce should there be a crisis. Now, on the flip side, maybe you don't, and that's okay. And we're going to talk about some ways to start thinking about what you could put in place. And when we're talking about communication, the first thing that Breia and I thought of is how people digest information and situations. So how do you communicate with your employees, and how do different people, not just from a human to human approach, but culture and language and region of the world and life experience, how do you digest a situation in front of you? And then support. What are some touch points or gentle ways you can ensure the support is offered around the world and ensure that it's actually impactful? And with all of that, Breia, the first thing that popped to mind was duty of care. And what does that mean for a global multinational organization? Can you talk to us a little about that?
Of course. So duty of care is something that's just no longer a responsibility. It's really a legal obligation. Duty of care is this concept that means that an organization will have to adhere to a reasonable standard of care when taking actions that could potentially harm a group of employees. So employers, operating multinationally, have a global duty of care to their employees for their safety and their security and well-being. And that includes a globally mobile workforce that's traveling, living, and working abroad. And, in our dynamic world, emergencies can strike without warning, leaving organizations potentially scrambling to respond and could, jeopardize a successful international trip or assignment. And from, a risk management perspective, my goal is to empower my clients and emphasize how a well-prepared company can make all the difference when navigating crises internationally. And, we're thinking of crises, that can mean a number of things to a number of different people or companies. We could be talking about a natural disaster, earthquakes, floods. I'm located in Texas. We just had a tornado, hurricane-like, storm hit our area last week. That was something that, was a crisis. We have health crises such as a global pandemic and COVID-19. You have economic crises, recessions, periods of significant, economic downturn. You have your political, social crises when there's civil unrest, wars, conflicts, and then, environmental crises as well, when we're dealing with climate change. But there could also be something that could be specific and unique to a company. And they, as an individual company could be going through their own crisis. And I actually had a client that had to deal with something pretty devastating to an employee in Brazil, in a prominent town that's really big with oil and gas, customers there. And unfortunately, they had an expatriate that was leaving work, headed to his home in Rio, and unfortunately had to deal with an attempted carjacking and was murdered. That was something that was so tragic. And still remember to that day, getting the call from the client that had happened, and that crisis hit them. And they had to think of so many different ways of how they were going to show up for their employees, for that individual employee and his family who had to face that horrible incident, and then, how they were going to respond to that. So I know, Jen, we talked about the number of different components in terms of physical, emotional, psychologically, how, a company can show up in the event of a crisis. And I know that you had some kind of viewpoints around that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you talked about the different definitions of crisis, because it's not always, like you said, a COVID-19. More often than not, it is the death of an employee or a restructuring that's impacted a significant population, or one or two people. And that is enough to respond and make sure that you have support in place. And when we're thinking about a crisis or an event that's occurred within an employer organization, we really try to take it from, the term holistic keeps popping to mind. We look at physical safety, we look at emotional safety, and the practical needs of just a person. When we have an event such as, you gave the examples of tornadoes or hurricanes or tsunamis or wherever you are in the world, it's not usually the emotional component that comes in first. Sometimes we need to look at the practical needs. Are you sheltered? Are you fed? Do you have clothing and water? Are you safe? So we're almost looking at the practical bit, and then the other parts come into it. So it's the physical, the practical, and then the emotional, kind of the aftermath of the event that's occurred. And even in our space, when we're working with a client and we're asked about how do you support a global workforce when something does happen, it's pretty common that we'll have a request from a client, and you may see this too, Breia, when you're consulting with your clients. We'll have an HR leader reach out and say, hey, we just had the death of an employee, and that has just rippled throughout the workplace. And what we want to do is we want to help them develop a plan from an appropriate mental health perspective. So we often will bring a trauma professional on the phone to talk through them in their preferred language that understands the culture of the area of impact, and help them develop a plan. And maybe it's not appropriate to bring somebody on site to help with this crisis right away, or for an organization to interject right away. Maybe it makes sense for people to be at home with their families. So we want to make sure that we're viewing it around that perspective. And I think, Breia, you and I were talking about how leadership being on board is such a big part of this. I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about how you work with leaders in a company, or people who are building the case to leaders to help them build that case.
For sure. I think, all an organization, may not be able to anticipate every risk that their employees may face. They're just steps an employer can take and plan for some potential challenges that may arise. And I think first and foremost, executive buy-in is ultimately going to be critical to the success of a program designed to provide protection for employees working abroad. No international assignment strategy would be complete without the full support of an executive team, because there's so many, budgetary, considerations. There are some corporate, philosophies and things that have to be in place to back up, any type of response or emergency preparedness. So it's always great to understand who those key stakeholders are, and starting off with that executive leadership team is ultimately best. And I have had meetings with clients that maybe annually it's necessary to pull in different members across the organization that are going to be critical to understanding what's in place when you're assessing risks for the organization, pulling in your executive, committee, having your HR and benefits person there. If we have to fly in, and the HR VP, from the UK, and the operations manager from Australia, have someone fly in from like I said, Brazil, from HS&E. That's really important to take that time to have these stakeholders invest the time to understand what a company may have in place, and ensure that the roadmap you all have outlined, is clear. And, because what one team may be focused on, what one team may be prioritizing may be totally different. So doing that kind of deep analysis and due diligence, when appropriate, it's best. And because you don't want to be in that reactionary mode when you could have kind of had that time to take a step back and ensure that everyone's essentially kind of aligned, starting with the executive team.
Oh, that's such a great point. I was at a conference last week, and that was one of the vulnerable questions that an HR leader asked is, help me connect the dots with other departments and leaders from our team. And what you just mentioned is you want to know what the priorities of these other departments are, whether it's risk management or compliance or travel and safety, because then that will help kind of build the case. And we're often asked, like, tell me about ROI. What's my ROI on having something in place? And I don't know about you, Breia, but for me, I don't love to talk about ROI, especially when you're looking at a global workforce, a multinational company. You're looking at different healthcare systems and data, and how do you collect all of this? I defer the conversation as a best practice back to value on investment, and to put that into terms is, how do you measure, helping somebody who has suicidal ideation? And it's an even layer further, because how we're supporting somebody in an extreme situation like that varies so greatly from one country or culture to another, that it's really hard to put the pulse on ROI for something like this.
Yeah, it is. And I feel like starting off back in the day, when even the topic of wellness and well-being was just coming to the forefront in the United States, like that was one of the key areas of discussions when I would get into budget meetings, or when it was time to kind of review, programs, benefit programs globally, and US counterparts would be talking about these wellness programs and, okay, what is going to be the return? We're spending all this cost, what are going to be the implications, and are we going to be able to see how it's going to impact claims and all of our data and whatnot? And I'm so happy that we're moving past that conversation. It still comes up because you want to ensure that the investment is impactful. But at the end of the day, we're talking about human lives. And can you really attach a dollar amount to that, to someone's safety, security, health, well-being? To your point earlier, Jim, these are basic needs and necessities. And going back to the duty of care obligation, it's a responsibility to just ensure you're taking care of your employees. So I'm so happy that we're moving past that. And I love that we shifted from the ROI to the VOI, because that's really, and your employees can feel that. They're going to know and understand, wow, I really do feel like my company cares about me. It's just not, dollars and cents all the time.
Yeah, it's about doing the right thing and that human connection. And that's why we're here. And I don't know about you, but we've found that some organizations, sometimes they can be a bit resistant, or scared's the wrong word, but maybe unsure, overwhelmed with looking at what they have in place, or kind of assess any gaps or risks, or can't really prioritize for whatever reason. But I feel like when we were talking about this, you mentioned that you felt like the pandemic kind of forced that prioritization. Can you talk a little bit about that?
For sure. And I just would say, depending on where a company is at, in their journey, how they're engaging with their employees, they may or may be more or less resistant, to, prioritizing risk and how that works out. But if we think about the global pandemic that started, that was a situation where everyone had to prioritize, the risks within their organizations quickly. There wasn't time to say, oh, we'll get to that, later in the year. Like, no, this is happening now. And so that really forced risk prioritization in a whole new level, and taking that step back, to say, where are employees situated? What is happening, locally, in the given markets where they're at? Are we needing to focus on evacuations on an emergency basis? Are we needing to shut down certain locations to, stop the spread of a potential, of a virus at that point? There were so many different nuances. How are we going to reach out to our employees who are moving around, that are globally mobile? Where are they in this moment of time? So that was a situation where maybe some employers maybe didn't have maybe a whole risk preparedness plan mapped out. They had to kind of quickly get those things in order. And I'm sure that was a volatile, stressful time for a lot of individuals and for a lot of companies. So sometimes these crises put us into these situations where we have to respond immediately. But being as proactive as we possibly can is obviously the optimal
Yeah.
optimal place to be.
That's a great point. And we were talking earlier today, trying to bring it back to even just a digestible thought day to day. Breia and I were talking about how we're both parents. We both work. Breia owns her own business, which is amazing. And then all of the other factors that come into life. If you kind of as a person, if you don't plan a rest or a break for yourself, your body is going to break down and take that rest for you. And usually it's an inopportune moment. Kind of relating that into this is developing a plan. It never goes exactly to plan, and that's okay, but you have that infrastructure and that foundation to pivot as you need. And that's the best place to start.
It is. And I think that dealing with having a globally mobile workforce, and then having to add on top of that the rise of remote work and distributed teams, that is something that no one really knew we would be in the stage that we're at now, that driving to brick and mortar places. Now some obviously that are the essential workers in certain things, we have to be at certain given locations, but that rise has definitely caused a shift. And I just would love to explore kind of your thoughts, Jen, just around how you all have kind of seen how that plays a part in the mental and emotional well-being of employees. We're thinking about a crisis, even you're having so many people spread in so many different pockets, and how maybe the role of technology kind of impacts supporting those types of population.
Yeah, I love the topic of technology because from a philosophical perspective, as an organization with workplace options, we've always viewed technology as a pathway and not a destination. So technology is crucial in providing access, but our philosophy is that it's just that. It's a way to access whatever kind of support you need, whether it's in a crisis or in another way. So we're seeing in the spectrum of well-being, we're seeing heavy digital focus, and then anywhere to a more traditional way of engaging for care. And we like to fall in the middle, to your point, to allow that access through technology because it's invaluable. It allowed the world to operate for so long, almost as it was in a sense. But that human to human connection and need was still the heartbeat of the care that's provided in some sort of crisis. And I wanted to give an example around that. So using technology and thinking not even a way just to communicate, but also using technology and data collection around crisis, we do something really unique where within the information we collect from our clients and the individual members, we have something called a stress index. And I've recently learned about this and how we position this to our clients to help them either see trends or make more educated decisions. And what we found was interesting. I was working with one of our multinational clients, and they were really excited that they were overall presenting with low stress. And we're like, that's awesome in theory, but let's dive in a little bit deeper. And then we dive into this data and we look at these stress pockets, if you will. And again, this comes back to crisis. For us, this stress index, the hope is you can see trends that are coming in to potentially help you predict if something's going to happen. And again, the definition of crisis is different. But when we looked at this company's data, the overall low stress, which yay, we're going to snap and clap all around for that. But when we dive in, we saw that some countries actually had really high stress and really high stress for different reasons. And even when you think about stress for a global workforce, there are several countries that have regulations around stress, whether it's China or NOM 035 in Mexico or Japan. And when we were looking at, I think it was Germany specifically, workplace stress was the number one stressor or the symptom, but then the reason for that was actually around lack of recognition from leadership, which I thought was really interesting. And then on the flip side, we looked at China as another stress pocket, and workplace stress, yet again, number one symptom and pretty high, was around the daily work activities. So you'll see the presenting symptom of stress is the same, but the reason for it is different. And this all ties back into technology, allowing people to engage in support, but then trying to do something with that, hopefully from an organizational level, and say, hey, this is your overall top presenting issue or challenge, and let's look at it and dissect it a little bit to help give you more information to make educated decisions.
And I love getting into the data because it is super important, and it makes it just a little bit more relevant to an organization and to their population. I mean, talking about stress, something that's just, never going to be going away. And there was a study that Cigna Healthcare did, their vitality study from last year, and it talked about the incidence of stress. And from 2021 till present day, that number has remained at 80% and above. And that's quite high, for a group of individuals that are taking on these trips internationally, traveling. That is stressful in of itself. And you mentioned, Jen, workplace stress is obviously a contributing factor to that. And so, thinking of an employee's mental and emotional well-being, that's something that's critical to that overall stress. And, from that study, they said that 36% of participants did indicate having an organization provide them with mental health support was very important. It was third after having, private insurance and, maybe some flexible, work arrangements. But for that to be in the top three, having mental health support is something that's so, kind of telling to where we're at right now and how critical it is to the success of an assignment. And if you're in a heightened situation and, dealing with a crisis, just imagine that being even more prevalent.
Yeah. And these employees, they're looking to their employer like, hey, this is happening, help. That's just the world we live in, which is a great thing because employers can make such a huge impact, but kind of why we're here today. Like, how do you safeguard your employees and your organization? Which kind of leads me to one of our key takeaways, which we've touched on throughout, but communication. This is a big part of it. We talked about technology, we're talking about that human-centric approach and connection, but messaging, communication, leveraging that within your workforce. Like, Breia, can you talk to us a little bit about your thoughts on that within crisis management?
Sure. So, a company really needs to consider and develop a messaging approach for their global employees to handle emergencies, ensuring clear communication on what steps to take and, the protocol, in the event of a crisis. And, like I said earlier, although you can't anticipate every risk that an employee may be faced with, there can be some steps and things just to consider. And I think generally it's best to start off with just some basic questions like, how are you currently communicating with your population? Is it, via text message to a mobile device? Is there, a phone application that's sending out a push notification as an alert? Is there a message being posted to an intranet? Is it by telephonic outreach and calling someone? Is it on Teams? There's a lot of different ways. But ultimately, you have to understand within the culture and kind of where your population, where they're located, how they're used to, again, digesting information, what channels do you have set up, and how are they're tailored to a diverse workforce, and how individuals digest information, especially at a crisis moment, is super important. Getting in touch with their loved ones, their family members during this time. And oftentimes, we talked about earlier, starting with that C-suite level of engagement, that has to trickle down even to, like frontline managers, because those are the individuals something were to happen, someone's probably going to call a colleague, their manager. And so you want to ensure that multiple touch points are there. Those indirect touch points are there to ensure that everyone has access to information when it's going on. Even your vendor partners having, that level of insight and knowledge, because there could be a phone call that someone can place to their, their EAP vendor or, and to a provider to understand what could be going on. So I think having a playbook around what that looks like for your organization, how individuals can make the necessary, understand where they can access the necessary information, and obviously having that cultural component and understanding language, barriers, understanding that shouldn't be a factor, understanding that individuals need to make sure they can understand and can clearly receive the information that they need when in an emergency situation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you even brought up earlier you were working with an oil and gas client. I'm trying to think, just even simplifying it a bit, how you would communicate industry to industry, right? Not everybody sits in front of a computer or has even a work phone. Maybe it's a personal phone. During COVID-19, we had clients where they had people off the coast of remote areas on oil rigs versus people traveling from LA to New York or Tokyo to another part in the world, thinking about all those considerations, right?
And I think that there have been examples when, if there's a health emergency, let's say, for instance, in a remote location, and an evacuation, needs to happen. How quickly does that information get disseminated to even understand, okay, what's going to need to happen to deploy that type of situation, and understanding, okay, who are the key players that we have involved? We have the service provider, we have the individual, the employee, we have the family maybe that's there, or maybe back at home. We have management that's there as well. All of those individuals have to clearly be aligned on what needs to happen, how that needs to be coordinated. What's the protocol in the chain of command to ensure that individual gets transported medically, or from a medical needs perspective, how they get out of the situation that they're in. If they're in a remote location, where are they going to next logistically? How are we coordinating all of the different the planes and the equipment that's needed to safely evacuate and treat someone, and ultimately having an outcome of a timely evacuation and treatment plan to provide that care for someone if they are in a situation of a medical emergency. And so I think it's just ensuring that everyone understands who to connect with, what resources they have available to them, and what quick actions need to take place to ensure the safety and well-being of an employee.
There are so many layers, and
It
you
is.
mentioned, with that, even a lot of what we're seeing trending, you mentioned, whatever this crisis is, managerial support, making sure that managers feel supported or feel confident in supporting generally in that situation. And then also peer-to-peer support. Like you said, I'm going to pick up the phone and I'm going to call you if I can, right? Because of something that's happened. So working to empower peers within your organization.
Exactly. And I think it's the most recent, global crisis that, that has touched every single one. We have crises happening right now in the world, but I think the crisis preparedness training has been something that is no longer something that just sits on the shelf somewhere. It's like, hey, where did that training book go that we put together? The person that may not even be working at this company anymore. I think reports are out there have shown that, 55% of organizations now have some type of crisis preparedness training specific to even a globally mobile workforce that, has protocols designed in the event of a natural disaster, if there is some type of political instability, or if there's a health emergency. That's a pretty good amount of employers that are out there that are, prioritizing this as they need to. Some companies have even gone to the extent of having crisis response teams internally embedded to ensure that their, teams all around around the world have access to people that can be on the ground to assist. And even, having the technology, I think most, firms, companies now have access to some type of platform where they can reach out to their employees, push something out there, or they employees know where they can go to receive, necessary information. So I think that there's been great strides. Always, something that is going to continue to evolve. So we don't want that to be static for, the people that are listening in today. Just keep that evolving. It has to be regular, frequent, consistent, clear communication.
Yeah, that's a big part of it, the consistency. And from a emotional or mental health perspective, we're asked a lot about mental health first aid and psychosocial safety and how do we support with that amid a crisis. And like you said, it's not one and done. It's continuous, you're changing. And again, it's a plan. And sometimes, or more often than not, the plan doesn't go to plan, and that's okay. But I feel like there's been a lot of really good information covered here. Is there anything else that's popping to mind around kind of safeguarding or working with leaders within an organization considering something like this, or maybe reevaluating something they have in place?
I would just say taking a stock of what you currently have is really important. There's so much, funds and budgets, financial aspects that come to benefit programs, having a holistic program in place for your employees. And I think going back to that first takeaway that we mentioned, doing the proper due diligence to ensure what you have is making an impact on your population, and that it's relevant, it's culturally appropriate, and it's going to be something that is definitely going to be something that can be utilized in the event of an emergency. So I think that's a really critical step. Sometimes it can be the most challenging step, just getting the right people in the door. And I encourage those that are in leadership positions to definitely, ensure that is happening. That should be something that is a mandatory conversation that's happening at a minimum on an annual basis. There's so many priorities, but at the end of the day, our talent, employees are the top priority. And so ensuring what they have available to them and what the company is offering, it shouldn't be looked at as a benefit burden. This is something that's truly something, again, is a responsibility and should be looked after with ultimate care.
Oh, I can't think of a better note to end on than something like that. You're spot on. You're spot on with that. And the people who take the time to listen to this, please reach out to Breia or myself if you want to talk a little bit more, or if you heard something in here that you want us to try again and elaborate on a little bit in another session. But today, I think the three things, Breia, keep me honest, that we really wanted you to absorb or food for thought during our time together today. Again, the due diligence. Are you taking the time to review, assess, digest, and comprehend what you do have in place to navigate the care for your workforce should something happen like a crisis? And again, the definition of crisis varies. And if you're not at that place yet, it's just something to think about and we can help. Communication, are you aware, right, that people digest information differently, whether that's because of culture, technological availability, the kind of work that you're doing, life experience, making sure that you're communicating and how you communicate with your team members and their families, and then support. What could you put in place? What do you have in place? And how do you know if it's impactful? Breia, is there anything I missed, or do you think we covered what we were hoping to cover today?
No, those are the top three. And I'm happy that we had those just kind of key highlights for everyone, just to remember all of those three are so important. So thank you for sharing that with everyone.
Yeah. All right. Well, looking forward to podcast number 2. We're going to get that one next on the books, and we hope everybody comes back to listen to that one too.
Thanks so much, Jen.
Right. Thanks,
Great talking
Breia.
with you.
Bye.